A 57-year-old engineer with 15 programming languages on his resume applies to 18 internal jobs at the same company that hired him. He never gets past a single conversation. At the same time, his wife lands in the hospital and the medical bills arrive. He didn't lose his job for lack of work. He lost it because someone cheaper could sit in his chair. That story isn't rare. It's the system working exactly as designed. In 2025, mass layoffs crossed 1.2 million workers, and roughly a quarter of laid-off Gen X stayed unemployed for months. Over 40% of older workers have no retirement savings despite needing north of $1 million to stop working. So here's the tension nobody names cleanly. When did the golden years quietly become another stage of living paycheck to paycheck? You were sold a contract. Work hard, stay loyal, climb the ladder, and the company carries you to a dignified exit. For one narrow window of history, that contract was real. In the early 1980s, 44% of men retired after spending 2 decades at a single employer. Today, fewer than 30% do. That collapse isn't a culture problem. It's an incentive problem, and the incentive shifted underneath you. To understand why older workers are now the first targets, you have to understand something uncomfortable. Retirement itself was never natural. It was an invention, engineered for specific reasons at a specific moment, and now it's being uninvented. The same forces that built the dignified exit are the ones dismantling it. Follow the money and the machinery, and the cruelty stops looking like cruelty. It starts looking like math. Start with the cold baseline. For almost all of human history, retirement didn't exist for ordinary people. You worked until your body failed, then you died. The only exit was handing the family farm or business to your eldest child in exchange for being fed and sheltered in old age. It was a private arrangement enforced by blood and obligation, not by any institution. Aging was a household liability, not a life stage. The first crack in that arrangement came in 1875 when the American Express Company introduced the first private pension in the United States. Eligible employees got 50% of their average pay from their final 10 years, starting at age 60 after 20 years of service. It sounds generous, but read the fine print. It was granted or withheld entirely at the employer's discretion. A benefit you can revoke at will isn't a right, it's a leash. Industrialization made the old household model impossible. Children moved to cities and stopped inheriting land, so they stopped owing care to their parents. Meanwhile, the economy turned brutal and physical, with stagnant wages and dangerous factories. Older bodies aged out fast, and there was no farm to retreat to. A whole generation was stranded between a dying family system and a workplace that chewed them up and discarded them. Sound familiar yet? Here's how thin the safety net actually was. By 1932, after decades of so-called pensions, just 5% of the elderly population received any retirement benefit at all. The rest worked or starved or depended on relatives. The pension wasn't a worker's right. It was a retention tool for the few employees a company wanted to keep, and a quiet way to manage who got pushed out. The discretion was the whole point. World War II changed the equation. Briefly, wartime production was so hungry for labor that it pulled in women and older workers alike. Factories ran around the clock, wages rose, and pension participation expanded. For a moment, every working body had value because the system genuinely needed every body it could find. Remember that condition. Demand for labor is the only thing that has ever protected the worker. Not loyalty, not gratitude. Demand. But even after the war, Americans resisted retirement. In 1951, a sociologist surveyed steel workers at Inland Steel and found something striking. Fewer than half of men aged 62 to 64 actually wanted to retire. Nearly 90% rejected any mandatory cutoff at 65. Over half thought retirement was only for those physically broken. To them, stopping work wasn't a reward. It was a death sentence dressed up as leisure. Scientists even coined a term, retirement neurosis, depression, drinking, and decline that supposedly followed the moment a man stopped working. Identity was so fused to labor that removing the job removed the person. This created a problem for the people who wanted older workers gone. They needed a way to make leaving feel desirable. So they did what every system does when behavior won't cooperate. They ran a marketing campaign. Entrepreneurs, corporate leaders, and even Congress deliberately rebranded old age. Through public relations, they manufactured a glossy image of the golden years, leisure, travel, freedom, dignity. Companies rolled out pre-retirement courses teaching workers how to budget, handle healthcare, and fill their newly empty days. The National Council on Aging reported hundreds of major firms adopting this. Retirement wasn't discovered. It was sold the way any product is sold, to serve someone else's interests. And for a genuinely unique window, the sale was honest. Defined benefit pensions plus Social Security. Gave the average worker a reliable income stream until death. A man could expect to leave work with autonomy, purpose, and a gold watch. This was new in human history. The working class, for the first time ever, could reasonably plan to stop working and not collapse into poverty. Hold that image, because it's about to be reversed. Now watch the gears run backward. Post-war prosperity weakened. Global competition arrived. Wealth consolidated back into fewer hands, and the labor demand that protected workers evaporated. Once a company no longer believes it needs to retain you, every promise built on retention pension becomes a cost it wants to shed. The pension didn't disappear because it was unaffordable. It disappeared because the leverage that created it disappeared. The contract was never sacred. It was always conditional. I want to ground this in a real person. A senior enterprise architect, 25 years in tech, just laid off from a big tech company. He went viral describing how older workers now feel disposable. His diagnosis was precise and chilling. In leadership's eyes, he said, the worker has stopped being a human being and become a machine, a unit of production, a resource on a spreadsheet to be optimized down. That word resource is the whole essay in disguise. We literally call the department human resources. When a person becomes a resource, the logic that follows is automatic. You don't reward a resource for loyalty. You don't owe a resource a future. You acquire it cheaply, use it efficiently, and replace it the moment a cheaper substitute appears. There's no malice in it. That's exactly what makes it so hard to fight. The clearest proof of the resource logic is the H-1B replacement scandal. The pattern: lay off experienced American workers, then force them to train their foreign replacements as a condition of getting severance. In 2015, it broke into national headlines. Southern California, Edison, Fossil, and Disney all ran large-scale layoffs that required displaced employees to teach the people taking their jobs. Humiliation became a clause in the exit paperwork. Take Leo Pereira at Disney. He had just received high-performance reviews. He was called into a personnel meeting expecting a raise and a promotion. Instead, he learned he was being let go and that he would train his replacement. A worker flown in from another country would sit at his exact desk in his exact chair, doing his exact job. He called it the most humiliating and demoralizing experience of his life. His replacement told him the number. He was making roughly half Pereira's salary with no benefits. That single figure is the entire transaction. Decades of accumulated experience, institutional knowledge, judgment, mentorship, all of it weighed against a 50% labor cost reduction and found wanting. Pereira said it plainly. I didn't get laid off for lack of work. I got laid off because somebody cheaper could do my job. Disney claimed laid off employees could still find other roles internally. The workers described a different reality. One 57-year-old veteran applied to 18 positions and never advanced past an opening chat. Few people they knew got rehired, and when they did, it was at lower pay. The official story and the lived experience diverged completely, which is the signature of a system protecting its narrative while doing the opposite underneath it. Understand the mechanism, not just the outrage. These companies rarely hired the visa workers directly. They used outsourcing firms as intermediaries. Those firms don't just supply replacements. They multiply the reach of each visa, stretching a law meant for scarce specialized talent into a general wage suppression engine. The original intent gets hollowed out, and what remains is a legal-looking pipeline for converting expensive workers into cheap ones at scale. And don't mistake the visa worker for the villain. They are trapped in near-total dependency. A single termination can instantly cancel their legal status. That threat forces compliance, suppressed wages, unpaid overtime, constant relocation, and the permanent fear of deportation. The system pits a vulnerable foreign worker against a discarded older one, while the firm that profits from both stays invisible. Two groups fighting over scraps, while the table stays fully set elsewhere. The architect was honest about the brutal arithmetic. Older workers cost comparatively more. H-1B workers cost comparatively less, and the capability gap has narrowed. Recent generations of visa engineers, in his experience, are genuinely well-skilled at the craft, so the older worker can't even retreat to pure competence as a defense. When the cheaper option is also competent, experience alone stops being a moat. It becomes a line item to cut. He named the trap that makes severance so dangerous. You can hold a good engineering job for decades and still, because life happened, have no real savings or investments. When that worker is cut, severance isn't a cushion, it's survival money. So they'll do whatever it takes to get it, including training their own replacement. That's how dependency gets weaponized. Desperation is the most reliable form of compliance any system can buy. Now trace how the savings disappeared in the first place, because it wasn't an accident. The 401k was never meant to replace pensions. It was designed as a supplemental tax shelter for high earners, but corporations saw an opportunity. By 2008, pension participation had fallen from 38% to just 20%, while 401k participation climbed from 8% to 31%. A supplement quietly became the main event. The burden shifted, and almost nobody noticed the swap. Think about what that transfer actually accomplished. A defined benefit pension is the company's obligation and the company's risk. A 401k is your obligation and your risk. Market crashes, bad timing, insufficient contributions, all of it lands on the individual. The firm sheds a liability and calls it empowerment. You got freedom, technically. The freedom to absorb every risk the corporation used to carry, with none of the resources it had to carry it. The numbers expose the result. The median Gen the 10th worker has just $10,000 saved for retirement. The median Gen the 10th household holds around $40,000. To retire securely, the figure tossed around is over $1 million. That's not a gap. That's a canyon. An entire generation was handed the responsibility of pensions without the income, stability, or compounding time that made pensions work. They were set up to fall short by design. Boomers look better only by comparison. Yes, their median balances are higher, but many are entering retirement still over $1 million short of financial security. The golden years that were marketed so carefully in the 1950s now arrive underfunded. The generation that was promised the dignified exit is discovering the exit was quietly defunded while they were busy being loyal. The brand outlived the product it was selling. So people lean on Social Security even though it was never meant to be a full retirement plan. Among Americans 60 and older, 69% expect to rely on it, and 47% say they'll be very reliant. But the Social Security trustees project that by 2035, payroll taxes will cover only about 75% of scheduled benefits. The backstop everyone is counting on is itself running short. The floor has a hole in it. Gen the 10th sits at the worst intersection of all this. They took the heaviest wealth hit in the 2008 recession, right in their prime earning years. Many now support aging parents and dependent children simultaneously, the so-called sandwich generation. They're economically exposed on every side at once. And exposure, in the cold logic of the spreadsheet, makes you the cheapest thing to cut because you have the least power to resist. When there's no retirement security, no safety net, and no realistic path back to stable work, the cost of staying employed stops being merely financial. It becomes physical. People absorb punishment they'd never accept if they had options. Fear keeps them at the desk past every reasonable limit. And here the architect told me a story I haven't been able to shake, because it shows where this logic actually ends. He had a colleague, another software architect, on a digital transformation project a couple of years back. The kind of project people call a death march. Executives set a target and declared it immovable, regardless of human cost. So everyone worked late nights and early mornings, week after week, wash, rinse, repeat. The promised relief was a single week off from Christmas to New Year's, with go-live scheduled the very next workday. The colleague had a child. He talked about how badly he wanted that winter break, how much he was looking forward to spending real time with his kid. Then one day, he simply didn't show up for work. The next day, word came that he was in the hospital with a heart issue. A week later, during the very break he'd been counting on, they learned he had died. He never got the time. The architect put it in terms that strip away all comfort. His coworker had given his life for a machine, for something physically incapable of caring about him or loving him back. Meanwhile, he had a family fully capable of both, and he couldn't give his life to them because the machine had already taken it. That is the terminal value of treating a human being as a unit of production. The unit eventually breaks. This is the part people underestimate. The damage doesn't stop with the older worker, it cascades downward. Millennials and Gen Z are watching their parents, who gave decades to a company, get discarded with little protection. They're absorbing a lesson in real time, written in their own family's experience. And the lesson is simple and corrosive. Loyalty is not reciprocated. The contract you were taught to honor is honored by no one above you. This finally explains the lazy and entitled label thrown at younger generations. It isn't a character flaw. It's a rational response to observed data. When you grow up watching hard work and loyalty convert into disposability, the expected return on self-sacrifice collapses. Why pour your life into a system that demonstrably discards the loyal? Refusing to overinvest in an employer that won't reciprocate isn't entitlement. It's a generation pricing risk correctly for the first time. The architect described his own shift in worldview, and it's worth quoting. He went from seeing this country as the beacon of the world, where the sky was the limit, to something that reminds him of a low-budget Blade Runner. That's not nostalgia. It's a man who climbed the ladder, succeeded, and still watched the ground move beneath him. When even the winners feel the dystopia, the system isn't malfunctioning. It's revealing itself. He thinks about his teenage son constantly. What does the kid need to do to prosper now? It worries him deeply. For himself, he's fine. He's saved and invested across his tech years, so even booted out of the industry, he's comfortable. He half-jokingly calls it involuntary early retirement. But he believes future generations have been handed a genuine injustice, and he openly wonders what he can do to keep his kids from being sacrificed. Here's the structural insight he reached, and it's the hinge of everything. We are back in a familiar cycle. Older workers are deemed useless, their experience and mentorship suddenly worthless. Younger workers are deemed not yet valuable, unable to break into entry-level roles at all. Both ends of the workforce are simultaneously discarded. The last time this exact configuration appeared was the end of the Gilded Age in the early 1900s, and that historical rhyme contains the strategy. He studies archive footage of labor protests obsessively. Early in the Gilded Age, the protests were almost entirely young people, and they were easy to dismiss and ignore. But by the end, the footage shows something different. Older and younger workers marching side by side. That combination is precisely what forced change. Age plus youth, experience plus energy, stakes plus stamina. Together they became impossible to wave away. The mechanism is about credibility. Young workers carry a stigma, lazy and entitled, that lets the powerful dismiss their grievances on sight. But older workers carry maturity, a public voice, and the moral weight of having families depending on them. When they stand with the young, the lazy narrative collapses because nobody calls a discarded 57-year-old veteran entitled. The coalition strips away the excuse the system uses to ignore each group separately, which is exactly why the architect is frustrated by what he sees instead. When videos about older workers being laid off appear, he hoped they'd spark unity. Instead, the comments are older workers blaming young people for accepting lower wages. He doesn't understand it. He gets the wage dynamic, but asks the obvious question: why aren't we focused on the employer, the corporation, the shareholder primacy mindset that engineered all of it? Why attack sideways instead of upward? This lateral blame is the system's quietest defense. When emotions run high and your family's survival is on the line, you want something to attack, and the nearest target is the other worker, not the distant decision maker. So young blames old blames young, citizen blames immigrant. Every drop of that energy spent sideways is energy not spent upward. Divided workforces are cheap to manage. That's not a side effect, it's the design. And he names the stakes if the infighting continues. Jobs get automated, jobs get offshored, and eventually, in his words, we'll all just be twiddling our thumbs, having spent our leverage fighting each other instead of the forces actually replacing us. The window for coalition is open now precisely because both generations are hurting at the same time. Shared pain is the only raw material solidarity has ever been built from. Waste it and it closes. His proposed starting point is smaller and stranger than a movement. It's the family. He's read deeply on the origins of the American education system and argues it was built intentionally to pull authority away from the family and into the hands of the state. Whatever you make of that claim, his point lands. The same crisis cracking the workforce is an opening to rebuild the household as a unit that actually shares information and risk. Concretely, it starts with conversation. Parents telling their kids the truth. Maybe the job market isn't as strong as I claimed. Maybe the American ideal isn't what I sold you. Maybe I should be more present. And kids asking their parents the questions they've avoided. What do you actually know? What do you wish you'd done differently? What should we do as a unit? Information that flows across generations is leverage that the spreadsheet can't price. There's a sharp economic logic underneath the sentiment. When you and your parents both experience a broken job market, you share a problem, and shared problems unify. The mentorship the architect received from older workers is exactly what built his career, and he calls its loss devastating. A workforce that no longer transmits experience downward is a workforce that relearns every mistake from scratch. That isn't just sad. It's an enormous compounding economic waste. He even forecast the news cycle, and it's worth taking seriously. 2025 was the year Gen Z couldn't enter the job market. 2026, he predicts, will be the year of older workers being laid off. The same crisis simply rotating off the headlines as it accelerates underneath. His hope is that by 2027, the story becomes the American workforce demanding more. Notice the structure. The problem won't vanish. It will just stop being reported. Attention fades faster than harm. What he wants rebuilt are two things we broke at once: respect for elders and the elders' own desire to teach and nurture young minds. Both halves of the transmission failed simultaneously. The young stopped listening because the old looked like cautionary tales, and the old stopped teaching because the young looked ungrateful. Repairing one without the other does nothing. It takes both sides deliberately to restart a flow that the market quietly switched off. His practical ask is to raise the standard on the official story. Refuse the convenient labels companies hide behind. No, you're not firing because of AI. No, that's age discrimination. Name it. He points to the TJAA petition he's been building, which grew from 300 signatures to over 50,000, aimed at rebuilding how job applications are handled. Small leverage honestly applied, but leverage starts with refusing to accept the explanation you're handed. So here's the cold conclusion the opening promised. Retirement was never a right. It was a tool, invented when employers needed to retain and manage workers, marketed when they needed to push older ones out gracefully, and abandoned the moment cheaper labor and weaker leverage made retention unnecessary. The dignified exit didn't fail you. It was withdrawn on schedule the instant you stopped being the cheapest competent option in the room. That's the whole machine, and the most uncomfortable part is that none of it requires villains. No one has to hate you to discard you. They just have to run the arithmetic, and a unit of production that costs more than its replacement is by definition a unit to retire. The cruelty you feel is real, but it isn't personal. It's structural. Mistaking structural logic for personal betrayal is exactly the error that keeps workers fighting each other instead of the structure. The only counter leverage that has ever worked is the one from the end of the Gilded Age. Old and young, side by side, refusing the labels that divide them, redirecting their anger from each other toward the decisions and the decision makers that engineered the squeeze. Solidarity isn't a feeling here. It's a strategy, and it's currently the cheapest one available to you because the system is paying a fortune to keep you from using it. If this is the kind of analysis that's actually useful to you, subscribe. I cover the mechanics of money, work, and incentives in a way designed to make you think more precisely, not feel more motivated. There's a difference, and that difference is the entire point of this channel. Most content wants your emotion. This wants your attention on how the machine actually runs, even when, especially when, the answer is uncomfortable to sit with. The next one is going to be just as cold about something people get just as emotionally wrong, the raise. Why the loyal employee who stays is systematically paid less than the one who leaves, and why every company knows it and prices it in any way. Same detached lens, same uncomfortable math, same refusal to flatter you. Bring your skepticism. That's the only thing worth bringing to questions this expensive. I'll see you there.